luxurious airport terminal buzzed with activity as travelers rushed to their destinations, oblivious to the drama unfolding at Gate 37. Among them stood Catherine Hackman, daughter of the legendary actor Gene Hackman. Though few would recognize her, she preferred it that way, making her own path without trading on her father's fame. Dressed in simple jeans and a worn leather jacket, her understated appearance concealed both her heritage and her substantial personal achievements. Comment where you're watching from today, as we dive into a story of mistaken identity that would soon turn the world of first-class air travel upside down. Catherine approached the counter with her economy ticket in hand, exhaustion evident on her face after 3 connecting flights. A last-minute family emergency had forced her to book whatever was available, and now she simply hoped to upgrade to first class for the final leg of her journey. The customer service representative, a woman named Vanessa with an immaculate uniform and practiced smile, glanced at Catherine's casual attire with barely disguised judgment. "I'm sorry, miss, but first class is fully booked," Vanessa stated flatly, despite the computer screen clearly showing several available seats. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy anyway." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable as she looked Catherine up and down once more. What Vanessa couldn't possibly know was that Catherine wasn't just any passenger. Her father, Gene Hackman, had recently acquired majority ownership of Pinnacle Airlines through his diversified investment portfolio, the very airline whose counter she stood at now. Catherine, however, had specifically asked her father not to inform the company of their connection, determined to make her own way as the accomplished environmental lawyer she had become. "I understand if it's fully booked," Catherine replied calmly, though she could clearly see the screen. "But perhaps you could check again. I've had a rather difficult journey, and I'd be willing to pay for the upgrade." Vanessa's smile tightened as she made a show of checking the system again. "As I said, we reserve our first-class accommodations for our premium customers. It's not simply about having the money to pay for an upgrade." She lowered her voice slightly. "It's about maintaining a certain standard, you understand?" Behind Catherine, a well-dressed businessman chuckled quietly at the exchange. Bradley Thornton, CEO of a mid-sized tech company and a frequent first-class flyer, had been watching the interaction with amusement. He stepped forward, placing his designer briefcase on the counter. "Perhaps I can be of assistance," he said, addressing Vanessa while barely acknowledging Catherine. "The young lady clearly doesn't understand how these things work. I'll take my usual seat, 2A, and let's not waste any more time with hopeless requests." Catherine stood her ground, neither intimidated nor provoked. Years of courtroom battles had taught her to remain composed in the face of arrogance. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she explained, "just the opportunity to purchase an available upgrade." Vanessa's attention had fully shifted to Bradley, her demeanor transforming into one of eager servility. "Of course, Mr. Thornton. Your seat is ready, and we've prepared your preferred champagne. As for you," she turned back to Catherine, "economy boarding will begin in approximately 45 minutes. The growing tension at the counter had begun to attract attention from other travelers. A few cast sympathetic glances toward Catherine, while others seemed to side with the airline staff, viewing her as someone trying to step beyond her proper place. An elderly man reading a newspaper nearby observed the scene with particular interest, his eyes twinkling with what might have been amusement or concern. Bradley hadn't moved away yet, seemingly enjoying the moment. "You know," he said, now addressing Catherine directly, "first class isn't just about the wider seats or better food. It's about being among peers." He gestured vaguely at her attire. "Some things can't be bought with just money. There's a certain belonging that's required." Catherine took a deep breath. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about the principle. "And what exactly makes someone belong in first class, Mr. Thornton? The price of their watch? The label on their clothes?" Bradley laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "When you've achieved enough in life, you'll understand. There's a natural order to these things. Some lead, others follow. Some fly first class, others don't." The elderly man with the newspaper had now folded it away and was making his way toward the counter. There was something familiar about him that Catherine couldn't quite place, though her attention remained focused on the increasingly uncomfortable confrontation. Vanessa intervened, her professional mask firmly back in place. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step aside, miss. We have other passengers to assist. She gestured toward the growing line behind Catherine. What happened next would later be recounted by numerous witnesses, each adding their own embellishments to the tale. The elderly man approached the counter, standing beside Catherine. Without a word, he handed Vanessa a business card. Her eyes widened as she read it, her complexion paling noticeably. Sir, I had no idea you were, Vanessa began, but the man raised his hand gently, cutting her off. I've been observing this situation, he said quietly, and I'm curious, is there truly no first-class seat available for this young woman? Vanessa's fingers flew across the keyboard, her previous assertions forgotten. It seems there was a system error. We do have availability after all. Bradley Thornton, still standing nearby, looked confused. Excuse me, but who exactly are you to override established protocol? The elderly man smiled kindly, ignoring the question. Instead, he turned to Catherine. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Would you still like that upgrade? Catherine studied the man's face, a creeping recognition dawning on her. He wasn't her father. Gene Hackman was currently overseas, but he was someone connected to Pinnacle Airlines, someone with authority. Before she could respond, another airline employee rushed over, whispering urgently into Vanessa's ear. The atmosphere shifted palpably as the truth began to circulate among the staff. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she processed Catherine's upgrade, avoiding eye contact. Miss Hackman, we sincerely apologize for the confusion, she said, her voice now dripping with remorse. Your first-class seat has been confirmed. Boarding will begin in 20 minutes. Bradley Thornton's expression shifted from confusion to shock as the name registered. Hackman? As in ... Catherine simply thanked Vanessa, took her new boarding pass, and turned away from the counter. The confrontation was over, but the story was just beginning. A story about assumptions, privilege, and the invisible connections that bind the world of the wealthy and powerful. As she walked toward the premium lounge, the elderly man fell into step beside her. You didn't tell them, he observed quietly. It wasn't relevant, Catherine replied. And you are? The man extended his hand. James Mercer, board member at Pinnacle. Your father and I go way back, though he never mentioned how much his daughter takes after him. Same determination, same principles. And so began an unlikely alliance that would soon shake the foundations of Pinnacle Airlines, exposing not just one incident of discrimination, but a pattern that reached into the highest levels of the company. A company that, unbeknownst to most of its employees, was now owned by Gene Hackman himself. The first-class lounge of Pinnacle Airlines stood as a testament to luxury, a stark contrast to the chaotic main terminal just beyond its frosted glass doors. Persian rugs cushioned footsteps, while ambient lighting cast a warm glow over leather armchairs and marble-topped tables. The air was perfumed, with subtle notes of sandalwood and fresh-cut flowers, punctuated by the delicate sound of crystal glasses meeting in quiet toasts. Catherine Hackman sat in a corner seat, observing the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading people and situations. James Mercer had excused himself to make a phone call, leaving her with a glass of sparkling water and her thoughts. Across the lounge, Bradley Thornton held court with two business associates, occasionally glancing in her direction with poorly concealed curiosity. The first-class passengers formed a particular ecosystem, the entrepreneurs checking market updates on tablets, celebrities hiding behind designer sunglasses, and old-money travelers who wore their privilege like comfortable old sweaters. Catherine had moved through these spaces before, but always felt like an anthropologist, studying a foreign culture rather than a participant. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father. Landed safely in Tokyo. How's your trip going? She smiled, imagining Gene Hackman, the man who had conquered Hollywood, but still insisted on making his own breakfast, sitting in some luxurious hotel room across the world, genuinely concerned about her comfort on a routine domestic flight. She chose not to mention the incident at the gate. Her father had enough to worry about with his unexpected foray into airline ownership. The truth was, Gene Hackman's acquisition of Pinnacle Airlines had been almost accidental, part of a larger investment package he'd agreed to after retirement, diversifying his considerable fortune. The fact that he now owned a controlling stake in the company had been kept deliberately quiet at his insistence. "I'm an actor, not an airline magnate," he'd told Catherine over dinner when the deal was finalized. "The last thing I need is people expecting me to fix their flight delays." James Mercer returned, settling into the chair opposite Catherine with the careful movements of a man who had spent decades in boardrooms. "I've taken the liberty of alerting the flight crew to ensure your journey is comfortable," he said, without, of course, revealing exactly who you are. Catherine set her phone down. "That's not necessary, Mr. Mercer. I'm perfectly capable of enduring a few hours in a standard first-class seat without special treatment." "James, please," he insisted with a small smile. "And it's not special treatment. It's damage control. What happened at the counter concerns me greatly. Pinnacle prides itself on exceptional service." "For certain customers," Catherine amended. James' expression became thoughtful. "Yes, that seems to be the unfortunate reality we're facing. Your father may have acquired this airline as an investment, but I suspect he wouldn't appreciate discovering his company engages in such selective courtesy." The conversation paused as a lounge attendant approached with fresh drinks. Once they were alone again, Catherine leaned forward slightly. "You said you and my father go way back. How exactly do you know each other?" A nostalgic smile crossed James's face. "Before your father was Gene Hackman, with his name above movie titles, we were both young men trying to find our place in the world. I was managing a small regional airline, just 3 planes and a dream, when your father invested his first significant movie paycheck into the business. He said he liked my ambition." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "That little airline eventually became part of what is now Pinnacle. Your father sold his stake years ago, made a tidy profit, but we've remained friends." "Yet he never mentioned you," Catherine observed. "Your father compartmentalizes his life quite effectively, always has. Hollywood friends, business associates, family, all in separate boxes." James set his glass down. "Which is why most of the board has no idea he now owns the company. They believe our new majority shareholder is an anonymous investment group." Across the lounge, Bradley Thornton was now standing, preparing to leave with his companions. His path to the exit would take him directly past Catherine's seat. As he approached, his steps slowed, curiosity evidently overcoming his earlier disdain. "I couldn't help but overhear your name at the counter," he said, stopping before them. "Any relation to Gene Hackman, the actor?" Catherine met his gaze evenly. "He's my father." Bradley's demeanor transformed instantly, his previous condescension replaced by eager familiarity. "Remarkable. I'm a huge fan of his work. The French Connection, The Conversation, absolute classics. I had no idea his daughter would be traveling with us today." "I find many people have no idea about many things, Mr. Thornton," Catherine replied calmly. James Mercer watched the exchange with the measured gaze of someone evaluating a business proposition. Bradley seemed to miss the subtle rebuke in Catherine's words. "You must join me for a drink during the flight. I'd love to hear stories about growing up with such a legend for a father." "I prefer to read during flights," Catherine responded, "but thank you for the invitation." Undeterred, Bradley pressed on. "At least allow me to apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. Had I known who you were—" "That's precisely the problem," Catherine interrupted, her voice remaining level, but taking on the precision she typically reserved for courtroom arguments. "Your courtesy shouldn't depend on who you believe someone to be. The woman in economy with a crying baby deserves the same respect as anyone else." Bradley's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, but surely you understand that connections matter in this world. Special considerations for special people is simply how business operates." James cleared his throat. "An interesting philosophy, Mr. Thornton. May I ask what business you're in?" "I'm the CEO of Vanguard Solutions," Bradley replied with evident pride. "We're a tech innovation firm specializing in customer experience software. In fact," he added with a self-satisfied smile, "we're currently in talks with several major airlines about implementing our systems." "Including Pinnacle?" James asked innocently. "We have a meeting scheduled with your executive team next week," Bradley confirmed. Our software would revolutionize how Pinnacle identifies and prioritizes its premium customers. Catherine and James exchanged a quick glance. "How fascinating," James said, rising from his seat and extending his hand. James Mercer, board member, Pinnacle Airlines. The color drained from Bradley's face as he automatically shook the offered hand. I had no idea. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir." "Indeed," James replied. "I look forward to hearing more about your company's approach to, what was it? Special considerations for special people? During your presentation next week." The boarding announcement for their flight saved Bradley from having to respond. He mumbled something about gathering his belongings and retreated hastily. As they collected their things, Catherine gave James an appraising look. "You enjoyed that a little too much." "Perhaps," he admitted with a small smile. "But it's not every day I get to witness such perfect, dramatic irony. Your father would appreciate the scene." They made their way toward the boarding gate, other first-class passengers falling in around them. Catherine noticed Vanessa from the check-in counter speaking urgently with the gate agent, occasionally glancing in their direction. "I believe your presence has caused quite a stir among the staff," James observed. "Word travels fast." "I didn't want this," Catherine sighed. "The special treatment, the whispers, the sudden respect. It's exactly what I've spent my life avoiding." James nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the most powerful statement is simply being who you are, where you're not expected to be. The question now is, what will you do with that power?" As they approached the jetway, Catherine glimpsed the flight crew standing at attention, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The stage was set for the next act, in a drama none of them had anticipated when the day began. The Airbus A350 hummed with activity as passengers settled into their assigned seats. In first class, the atmosphere was hushed and efficient. Flight attendants moved with practiced grace, offering champagne and hot towels while stowing designer luggage. Catherine Hackman took her window seat in the second row, while James Mercer settled across the aisle. 3 rows ahead, Bradley Thornton was already nursing a glass of champagne, his earlier embarrassment apparently soothed by the premium cabin's comforts. The head flight attendant, a woman named Elaine with 20 years of experience etched into her poised demeanor, approached Catherine with particular attention. "Miss Hackman, welcome aboard. Is there anything specific I can get for you before takeoff?" "Just water, thank you," Catherine replied, noticing how Elaine's eyes lingered on her face, searching for traces of Gene Hackman in her features. The resemblance was there, in the set of her jaw and the observant quality of her eyes, but subtle enough that it went unnoticed without the context of her name. As Elaine moved away, Catherine turned to the window, watching ground crew scurry about their duties. The tarmac ballet of luggage carts and fuel trucks had always fascinated her. These were the invisible workers who kept the miracle of air travel functioning, yet another group whose contributions went unacknowledged by the Bradley Thorntons of the world. From economy class came the sounds of the final boarding groups, families with small children, solo travelers, and the occasional business person who hadn't been able to secure an upgrade. Catherine caught fragments of a heated exchange, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable. She glanced back to see a young flight attendant engaged in conversation with a middle-aged woman, their body language suggesting conflict. James had noticed too. "Trouble in paradise," he murmured, leaning slightly toward Catherine. The situation escalated as the passenger's voice rose. "I specifically requested a seat change. My daughter is sitting 10 rows away from me. She's only 7 years old." The flight attendant maintained a professional tone, though strain showed around her eyes. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but the flight is completely full. We can ask if someone would be willing to switch." "This is unacceptable," the woman interrupted. "I paid for these tickets months ago, and your system separated my child from me. How is that safe? How is that legal?" Catherine unfastened her seatbelt and stood, catching James's questioning look. "I'll be right back," she said quietly, making her way toward the confrontation. As she approached, the flight attendant, whose name tag read Sophia, looked relieved at the potential intervention, likely assuming Catherine was a senior crew member in plain clothes. The passenger, however, grew more agitated. Oh, wonderful. Another person to tell me why my completely reasonable request can't be accommodated, the woman said, exhaustion and frustration evident in her voice. Catherine offered a gentle smile. Actually, I'd like to help. I'm in first class, seat 2B. Your daughter is welcome to take my seat, and I'll sit in her assigned place. The woman's anger deflated instantly, replaced by confusion and then cautious gratitude. Are you serious? First class? Completely serious, Catherine confirmed. I have plenty of legroom in economy, and it's more important that you and your daughter can sit together. Sophia began to protest. Miss Hackman, that's really not necessary. The use of her surname caught the attention of nearby passengers, whispers immediately rippling through the cabin. Hackman? Like the actor? Did she say Hackman? The mother looked at Catherine with new understanding. You're related to Gene Hackman? He's my father, Catherine acknowledged, keeping her voice low. But that's not important right now. What matters is getting your daughter seated with you. Within minutes, the switch had been arranged. Catherine helped the young girl collect her backpack and stuffed unicorn, escorting her to first class, where her mother waited with tearful thanks. As Catherine made her way to her new seat in economy, a middle seat in row 23, she noticed Bradley Thornton, watching the scene unfold with evident disbelief. Economy class welcomed Catherine with considerably less ceremony than first class had. Her seatmates, an elderly gentleman by the window and a college-aged woman on the aisle, regarded her with mild curiosity as she settled between them. That was a nice thing you did, the young woman commented, looking up from her textbook. Not many people would give up first class. Catherine shrugged. A mother and child should be able to sit together. It seemed like the simplest solution. Still, the woman persisted, most people in first class wouldn't even notice what was happening back here, let alone care enough to help. As the safety demonstration began, Catherine caught sight of James Mercer, making his way down the aisle toward her. He stopped by her row, bending slightly to speak quietly. Catherine, there's no need for this. I've spoken with the purser. They can rearrange several passengers to accommodate both you and the mother-daughter pair in first class. I'm perfectly comfortable here, James, Catherine replied. Really, it's fine. James studied her for a moment, then nodded with something like respect in his eyes. Your father would be proud, he said before returning to his seat. The flight took off smoothly, the powerful engines pushing passengers gently back into their seats as the aircraft climbed through clouds into clear blue skies. Catherine sat with her eyes closed, feeling the familiar sensations of ascent, the subtle pressure changes, the banking turns, the moment when the seatbelt sign chimed off and the cabin came alive with movement. When she opened her eyes, she found Elaine, the head flight attendant, standing in the aisle beside her row. Miss Hackman, she said quietly, the captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Is something wrong? Not at all, Elaine assured her. He was simply informed of your presence on board and wanted to extend his personal welcome. Catherine glanced at her seatmates, who were both pretending not to listen with varying degrees of success. I appreciate the gesture, but please tell the captain I'm trying to remain low profile. I'd rather not draw attention. Elaine hesitated. Of course, although there are some matters regarding Pinnacle Airlines he hoped to discuss with you, given your father's recent involvement with the company. This caught Catherine by surprise. The captain knows about that? Senior staff were briefed last week, Elaine explained. Most employees haven't been informed yet, but management thought the flight crews should be aware of the ownership change. Catherine considered this new information. The very knowledge she had tried to avoid using was now circulating among the crew, undoubtedly coloring their interactions with her. It was exactly the kind of special treatment she had spent her life avoiding. Please thank the captain for me, but tell him I'm comfortable where I am, Catherine finally responded. If he has concerns about the airline, my father has appointed a transition team to handle operations. I'm just a passenger today. As Elaine retreated to first class, Catherine noticed several other flight attendants watching her with newfound interest. The elderly gentleman beside her cleared his throat. Forgive an old man's curiosity, he said, but am I sitting next to someone important? Catherine smiled. Not at all, just someone who happens to have a well-known father. Ah, he nodded sagely. The blessing and curse of famous parents. My daughter works for a celebrity. Says the hardest part is convincing people to see her as herself, not as an extension of her boss. Your daughter sounds wise, Catherine replied. The flight continued, and Catherine found herself experiencing a side of air travel rarely seen by first-class passengers. The cramped quarters, the careful coordination of bathroom breaks, the camaraderie that developed among strangers sharing elbow space for hours. When the meal service began, she observed the stark contrast between the casual chicken or pasta offerings in economy and the multi-course dining experience she knew was unfolding behind the curtain separating the cabins. From her new vantage point, Catherine saw Pinnacle Airlines with fresh eyes, not as an investment in her father's portfolio, but as a complex ecosystem where the experience of travel was profoundly unequal by design. And as the plane continued its journey across the country, a plan began to form in her mind, one that would shake the foundations of how airlines treated their passengers, starting with Pinnacle itself. The descent into San Francisco International Airport brought Catherine Hackman's journey full circle. As the plane banked over the bay, sunlight glinting off the water below, she found herself reflecting on the events that had transpired since she'd first approached the Pinnacle Airlines counter. What had begun as a simple request for an upgrade had evolved into something far more significant, a rare glimpse behind the curtain of privilege that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft, and by extension, the invisible hierarchies that structured so much of modern life. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed, and passengers around Catherine began the familiar ritual of preparation for landing, stowing tray tables, returning seats to their upright positions, checking for personal belongings. The elderly gentleman beside her had fallen asleep, his crossword puzzle half completed in his lap. On the aisle, the college student was highlighting passages in her textbook, racing to finish her studying before touchdown. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into San Francisco, the captain's voice announced over the intercom. The local time is 2:45 p.m., and it's a beautiful clear day with temperatures around 68 degrees. On behalf of myself and the entire crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with Pinnacle Airlines today. There was a brief pause before he continued, his tone shifting subtly. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to all our passengers who demonstrate kindness and consideration toward their fellow travelers. It's these small acts of generosity that make air travel a more humane experience for everyone. Catherine felt certain the message was directed at her, and she wasn't alone in that impression. Several nearby passengers glanced in her direction, the whispered story of her seat exchange having spread throughout economy class during the 5-hour flight. As the aircraft touched down with a gentle bump and the engine's reverse thrust, Catherine noticed Sophia, the young flight attendant from earlier, making her way down the aisle, checking that all passengers were prepared for arrival. When she reached Catherine's row, she leaned down slightly. Miss Hackman, the captain has requested that you remain seated after we reach the gate, she said quietly. There will be a representative from Pinnacle meeting the flight. Catherine raised an eyebrow. Am I in some sort of trouble? Sophia smiled. Quite the opposite, I think, though I'm not privy to the details. As the plane taxied to the terminal, Catherine observed the subtle change in how the crew interacted with her, a deference that hadn't been present when she boarded, despite her seating arrangement. Word had clearly spread about who she was, or more specifically, whose daughter she was. The very thing she had spent her career avoiding, special treatment based on her family name, was now unfolding around her, despite her best efforts. When the aircraft finally came to a stop and the seatbelt sign was extinguished, passengers stood in unison, the universal eagerness to disembark transcending class boundaries. Catherine remained seated as requested, watching as the economy cabin gradually emptied. The mother and daughter from earlier paused as they passed, the woman grasping Catherine's hand briefly. Thank you again, she said warmly. Amelia slept through most of the flight, but she loved the ice cream sundae they served in first class. She said it was like being a princess. Catherine smiled. I'm glad it worked out. Safe travels for the rest of your journey. As the last passengers filed out, Catherine noticed James Mercer waiting at the front of the economy cabin, deep in conversation with the captain, a distinguished-looking man with silver at his temples. Bradley Thornton was nowhere to be seen, presumably having deplaned with the other first-class passengers. James spotted her and approached, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Miss Hackman, you've certainly made an impression today." "That wasn't my intention," Catherine responded, gathering her belongings. "The most powerful statements rarely are intentional," James observed. "Come, there's someone who would like to meet you." They made their way through the empty aircraft to the jetway, where a woman in a crisp Pinnacle Airlines executive uniform waited. She extended her hand as they approached. "Miss Hackman, I'm Victoria Reynolds, Chief Operating Officer for Pinnacle. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I must admit the circumstances are unexpected." Catherine accepted the handshake. "Likewise, Ms. Reynolds, though I'm not sure what circumstances you're referring to." Victoria glanced at James before responding. "When your father acquired controlling interest in Pinnacle, he made it clear he would not be personally involved in operations. The board assumed we would continue business as usual, with quarterly reports sent to his financial team." She paused. "We had no idea his daughter would be conducting a first-hand assessment of our service." "I wasn't," Catherine began, but Victoria continued. "And I must say, what you've observed today is deeply troubling. The incident at check-in, the rigid class divisions, the mother and child separated. These are not the standards Pinnacle should uphold." Catherine studied Victoria carefully. "You speak as though these are isolated incidents rather than systematic issues." "Perhaps they have become systematic," Victoria acknowledged, "which is precisely why your father's investment could be transformative if he chose to take a more active role." They had reached the terminal now, where a quiet VIP lounge awaited. Inside, Catherine was surprised to find not only senior Pinnacle staff, but also the flight crew, including Sophia and Elaine. Even more surprisingly, the young college student who had sat beside her was there, looking somewhat bewildered by her inclusion. Victoria addressed the gathered group. "For those who haven't been introduced, this is Catherine Hackman, daughter of Gene Hackman, who recently became Pinnacle's majority shareholder. What none of us realized was that Ms. Hackman is also an environmental attorney with a reputation for transforming the companies she works with." Catherine raised an eyebrow at this unexpected research into her professional background. "Today," Victoria continued, "Ms. Hackman experienced our airline as both a first-class and economy passenger. She witnessed our shortcomings firsthand, and rather than leveraging her family connection for special treatment, she chose to give up her privilege to help another passenger." She turned to Catherine. "I believe we have much to learn from you, if you're willing to share your insights." For the first time since the journey began, Catherine felt a genuine opportunity had presented itself, not to receive special treatment, but to create meaningful change. Pinnacle Airlines has two distinct cultures operating simultaneously, she began, addressing the room. In first class, passengers are treated as individuals with unique needs and preferences. In economy, they're processed as a collective, their individuality secondary to operational efficiency. This isn't unique to Pinnacle, it's the industry standard, but it doesn't have to be. She turned to the college student. "I never caught your name." "Emma," the young woman replied, looking surprised to be acknowledged. "Emma is studying aerospace engineering," Catherine informed the group. "During our flight, she shared some fascinating thoughts about sustainable aviation fuel and how airlines could reduce their carbon footprint. Did anyone in this room ask her about that? Or was she just seat 23C, chicken or pasta?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Catherine continued, her courtroom experience evident in her measured delivery. "The woman who couldn't sit with her daughter? She's a pediatric surgeon returning from a conference where she presented breakthrough research. The elderly gentleman next to me? A retired English professor who taught literature to inmates as a volunteer for 30 years. Every passenger has a story that makes them as special as anyone in first class, but our current system only values certain types of specialness: wealth, status, frequent flyer miles." James Mercer was watching her with undisguised admiration. "What would you suggest, Catherine?" She met his gaze. "A complete rethinking of how we categorize and serve passengers. Yes, different fare classes make economic sense, but human dignity shouldn't be tied to ticket price. The basics, respect, comfort, assistance, should be universal." Victoria nodded slowly. That's a significant shift in industry thinking. It is, Catherine acknowledged, but Pinnacle has an opportunity to lead that shift. My father didn't buy this airline to maintain the status quo. He invested because he saw potential for something better. As the meeting continued into the evening, ideas flowed freely. Sophia suggested removing the curtain between cabins as a symbolic first step. Emma proposed a mentorship program where passengers with expertise could connect with Pinnacle employees interested in their field. James outlined a new customer service approach focused on recognizing the humanity of every traveler, regardless of fare class. When the impromptu session finally concluded, Victoria pulled Catherine aside. "Your father called while you were in flight. He's pleased you arrived safely, but mentioned you hadn't told him about the incident at check-in." Catherine smiled. "Some things are better addressed directly." He also said, Victoria continued, that if you felt Pinnacle needed direction, he would support whatever recommendations you made. She paused. I believe his exact words were, "If Catherine thinks the airline needs fixing, let her fix it." As Catherine left the airport that evening, the sun setting over San Francisco Bay, she reflected on how differently the day had unfolded from her expectations. What had begun as a routine journey had revealed not just the inequities of air travel, but also an unexpected opportunity to address them from a position of influence. Her phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Heard you gave up your first-class seat. Proud of you, kiddo. The airline's yours to sort out if you want the job. After all, looks like you already started." Catherine smiled at the message. Perhaps there were advantages to being Gene Hackman's daughter after all. Not for the privileges it might afford her, but for the platform it provided to create meaningful change. As her car pulled away from the terminal, she began mentally drafting the memo that would transform Pinnacle Airlines from just another carrier into an industry leader in equitable, dignified air travel. A transformation that would begin with a simple but revolutionary idea. Every passenger deserves to be treated with the same respect, regardless of the class printed on their boarding pass.